you're looking at the enemy of America, according to what she said. But I am a man also that is educated, that am educated beyond my intelligence. I come from a place where Abraham Lincoln used to ride the circuit. And the story goes, some of his relatives still live around there, and the story goes that at Charleston, Illinois, he was accused by Judge Douglas of running up to the north end of the state and saying one thing, and then coming down to the bottom end of the state and saying something else. And he said he was two-faced. Two-faced. And Lincoln said, if I had another face, do you think I'd be using this one? When you hear people talk about Common Core and what I know about it, I know, listening to Laura and listening to the parents and the teachers like we've heard today, of course, Nathan's taught me a lot. When I hear about it, I see that the people that promote it are saying one thing and doing quite another. Saying one thing and doing quite another. No. Alaska's curriculum is not like Common Core, but one of the seminars we had, I don't remember whether it was Nathan or Laura, but they presented side by side the Common Core and then Alaska Standards, and they said it wasn't the same, but what they did was they just exchanged synonyms in a few places. Technically, they were telling the truth, but in substance, they were delivering whatever Dirksen used to call terminological inexactitudes. That means it's a lie, just a lie, and a bold one. Very dangerous to do. Well, a little story about Lincoln. Again, I was told by a fellow who studies such things that this may be apocryphal. But the story goes that he was riding the circuit, the 8th Circuit, and it was a vast circuit. It took a lot of time. He had terrible family problems. He stayed away from home a lot. That's why he liked to be on the circuit, but it made him very popular. He was riding the circuit, and he would check in with his partner, Billy Herndon. And Billy is the one that told this story. And they usually share a bed. That's the way it was in those days. And Billy Herndon said, in the middle of the night, he was awoken. Which one it is, I don't know, but one of those two is proper. He was woke up, and he heard Lincoln's shrill, high voice saying something, and he looked, and he could see his silhouette sitting bolt upright in bed. And he said, this nation cannot survive half slave and half free. Well, we come to find out later, of course, that became very famous, and he used that in some of his famous presentations. This nation cannot survive half slave and half free. But that which he was quoting, I say this often, he who never quotes is never quoted, and Lincoln was quoting. He was quoting a man from Crete who said that half of the people that lived on the Isle of Crete owned the other half. And that was true throughout the Greek world, and that was true throughout the Roman Empire. Half of the people owned the other half in many places. But beyond that, and this is the point to which I'm driving, in those days there were two kinds of education. People understood the world this way, and when you were raising children, you either educated your children with a servile education, or you educated your children with an education of liberty, liberas. An education for slaves, and an education for what in common law we would have called the free man. It wasn't that one was demeaning in those days. They just said this is the way it is. If you're going to be educated as a slave, you're going to be educated not to exercise discernment, but you're going to be educated to carry out the will of the powerful party, who is the master. It is even said by men who know more than I do that the man that wrote the third gospel, Luke, the physician, was likely a slave, a highly educated one. one that brought profit to his master. We don't know for sure, so you can't insist on it. But the point I'm making is this. There are two kinds of education. One for slavery, one for liberty. And if you don't get the one for liberty, the country in which you live will not, and soon enough, will not be free. It will not experience that liberty. What are the arts of liberty? And this is what they taught them in those days and was brought into the West of the Christian world in North Africa later. Augustine of Hippo talks about it a lot. He says, I can understand most of what I hear, I can say most of what I think, and I can write down most of what I want to get across. Therefore, he said, I am an educated man. Now, if you'll think about what he said, and this is still yet true today, the liberal arts, ask a professor, what are the liberal arts in some liberal arts college? Most of them, I ask, don't have a clue. They come off like they know, but it's a lot simpler than they understand. And the ancient world said this, and it's absolutely true today, and if you teach your children these things, there's nothing else to teach them. And the liberal arts are these. This is what Augustine said. He could hear, he could speak, he could understand, put it in a nutshell, the arts of language. The arts of language. And people say, what about mathematics? That's the language art. Galileo said mathematics is the language with which God has written the universe. And it is a language. Mathematics has to do with symbols. And you learn how to communicate. And you learn the laws of nature that way through mathematics. But the arts of language are the arts of liberty. And I listen to what's being said about Common Core, and I look around me, and I've watched it for a long time. And reading, writing, listening, and speaking, reading, writing, listening, and speaking are not being stressed. What's being stressed instead? Critical thinking. And as every lawyer knows, where reason eclipses facts, and facts are tied up with language. Facts have a way of receding from consideration, and you live in a sea of unbridled subjectivity, where people don't even any longer know what sex they are. Supreme Court justices saying things that are so outlandish that I wouldn't want my children and grandchildren in the same room. That's where we are. And it comes down to they want your children's minds, and they want to steal them and educate them to be slaves. No, I'm not overstating the case. There was a time I wouldn't say that. It sounds too far out there, but it isn't. And I've watched it in other countries. I've watched it be done. I've been there. I've watched it here destroy lives. And it's time to fish or cut bait, because we're coming down to the wire and the lines are being drawn. Well, that being said, I've spent myself. I'll say a few more things maybe. Laura, I know what she needs. She needs steam. Steam. And she's only got so much. So encourage her as she spends herself doing what she's doing. And she's working very hard, running very fast. Her nerves are up, her blood is up, but she only got so much. So just encourage her. And there are different ways to do that. You'll figure that out. Nathan, MacPherson. Mac, not Muck. MacPherson. No fear in Pearson. I knew his father before I knew him. I've learned to learn from him. He's younger than me. But I've learned to like it. I want you to listen to Nathan. Nathan has done his homework. He who would win his cause with power must frame points of support and look with steady aim, said Justice Joseph Story. Attack their weak points, defend your strong with art, strike but few blows, but strike them to the heart. This whole Common Core thing can be destroyed with a few blows. Find the controlling question. It is dangerous, but it's just flat unlawful. That's it. And Nathan's going to talk about that. It's unlawful. And why? And that's the simplicity of the matter. Lawlessness is what's destroying us. Lawlessness. The only remedy to lawlessness, the madness of it, and the lack of freedom it brings, is true law. A. MacPherson.
Thank you, Brent. So, thank you all for coming. I'd like to ask a couple questions of you. Number one, why are you here? And number two, what would you like to learn? And to start that off, can we get a show of hands? Who here is independently homeschooling his or her children? Thank you. Homeschooling with government money, idea or otherwise?
Oh, sorry, that's fine.
I'll let you. And public school? Okay, so looks like maybe 2/3 homeschooling, 1/3 public school. So why did you all come? What would you like to know? Yes?
Well, I started off being independent, but once we moved to Alaska, we found out that you can use government money, which was great for me because I was like, well, we could do a lot of education with all this. And so I'm here this is my second year in Alaska, and my second year homeschooling here. And so what was hard for me is because they started, demanding that we take the test last year.
Yep.
And I just wanted to know what kind they were. I don't know how I came across Laura and you of the symposiums, but I listened to it online last year. And because I wasn't getting information, teachers weren't telling me.
Right.
But they demanded that we take it. And so, and there was no results, and it was just so frustrating. And so I just wanted to know more so I know where I stand. I want to know what decisions I'm making really.
Yeah, that's one of the biggest questions we get is from homeschoolers through the IDEA program or the others. What about these tests? What's the deal with that? That's the biggest concern. Thank you. Any other questions?
I would mirror that. We're out in Matthew Central, and we got out of the test last year, and they told us our oldest would likely have to take the test this year. And I said, fine, show me the contract before we start the next year. And there's nothing. There's no text in our IEP or whatever you call it, our schooling plan. So we figure we're going to get about halfway through the year, and they're going to say, you either need to test your child or give us the money back.
Okay.
At which point we have a fight.
Yep. You're in the right spot then. And so your contract did not contain a clause saying you must. Some of the parents are getting contracts where it says you agree that your children will take this test. That's interesting. Do you know, was it in yours for this school year?
I don't think I think it may have been in ours, and but I submitted a refusal form afterwards.
Okay.
I caught it afterwards.
Okay.
So
We're going to be talking about that, and our view is basically that it's a contract for an unlawful purpose, and therefore that provision is void. They cannot enforce it against you. But like I said, there might be a fight.
Yeah.
It's kind of, a lot of people, our clients say to us, they can't do that. They just did this to me, but they can't do that. You just said they just did do it. Like saying the speed limit is 40 miles an hour out there, that means I can't go 100 miles an hour? People do it all the time. It's not lawful, so that's where the fight comes in. Any other questions? Particular points? Okay. This thing just doesn't work the way we'd like it to. So ultimately, we're here to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our children. That's the purpose of the U.S. Constitution that established our Union of United States, and also the Alaska Constitution. Brent talked about education for liberty. So question number one kind of goes back to fundamentals. When we've heard a little bit about the two systems, Representative Brian Bull talked about this worldview clash. What is the purpose of education? I'd like to throw that out a little bit to the audience. Why are you educating your children? Why did you choose home education? Why did you choose public school education? What do you want your kids to get out of it? Yes, sir.
Well, wife and I have a vested interest in how our kids grow up and what they're taught.
Yes.
So therefore, people that we're most interested in our kids' welfare or
Nobody cares more about your children than you do. Yes?
yes.
Do you have something?
Just a solid education. I want them to go far, and like you said, no one's gonna really invest in them as much as I would, so I'm responsible for their future.
You're responsible for their
They're the
future.
and
Yes.
so I
That's
think very important.
a duty of the highest order. We'll be getting to that. Yes. Any other? Yeah.
Brent, you were alluding to a statement that comes out of a C.S. Lewis book where he was interviewing the British Department of Education leader, and the man said that there's two forms of education. One is for liberty and one is for labor. And that if you go to a trade school or a public school, you will be educated for labor. If you go on to the Oxfords of the world, then you will be educated for liberty. I'm not interested in raising laborers for the state. I want my
Excellent.
children to enjoy liberty.
So you are educating for liberty.
Yes.
Excellent. That's what John Adams said. Children should be educated for principles of freedom, liberty, freedom, synonyms. Noah Webster. Anybody know who Noah Webster was? Yep. Father of American education, wrote the 1828 dictionary, blue-black spellers. He also said, virtue and liberty and an inviolable attachment to global citizenship. Is that what it says there? No, an inviolable attachment to diversity, other countries, et cetera, well, to his own country. That kind of goes back to that nobody cares more about your children than you do. That doesn't mean that you don't care about your friends' children, your neighbors' children, but rather that we're sort of designed in a way that we care most about our own. And thus Alaskans ought to care more about Alaskans than they do Texans, etc. We have relatives in other states, right? My wife's even from another country. Doesn't mean that we don't like those from other places, but we need to focus first here because here's where we are, here's where we can affect. Noah Webster recognized that. Again, education is favorable to liberty. And you can't have a free society where people are not educated. So it's obvious that education is important, and it's obvious that the Founding Fathers, this is Dr. Benjamin Rush, another one of the Founding Fathers, sort of the second father of traditional American education. He was in accord with all of the others that education has to do with liberty. Then we get to the Common Core. If you look up in Noah Webster's 1828 dictionary, what does core mean? It has the meaning, well, where else is this word used a lot? In a book that predates the 1820.
Yes.
And it's the foundation of our common law.
The word heart is the old Anglo word for center, core, and it means will, volition, what you want. And the word heart in the ancient world always meant that. It means a few other things, but primarily, fundamentally, preeminently, it means will. And the French language is coeur. We have a place at home called Cri Coeur. That means heart. So when they're talking about common core, they're talking about a common will. And the question is, whose will do they want to be uniform in all of the children in the world? That's what they want. They want a uniform will. A uniform will? Does that take away anything from freedom of choice? These are fundamental questions. This isn't complicated stuff. They're striking at the heart of the matter. And the heart of freedom, as I mentioned a while ago, is to be able to exercise discernment, to take the first principles of right and wrong and apply them to your unique circumstances that never existed before. Same principle, different application. That's called discernment. But that's what this wants to do away with, in my humble opinion and studied opinion.
Well, it's obvious that the will of something that's written is going to be whose will? Well, that of the author, right? The author has the authority over the matter. So those who wrote the Common Core are those whose will be promoted by it. And as we'll show here, that is the United Nations. It's not even some Washington, D.C. bureaucrats, not Secretary Duncan, etc. Linda Darling Hammond was one of these authors. Well, how about this one? Quotes here are from the former Secretary General and Deputy or Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations talking about education. The world will not change, hope and change, the world will not change and find peace if there's not a new education. Anybody think that we're going to ever have world peace, by the way? Has there ever been peace in the world? Well, we don't know how long Garden of Eden lasted, but after that there hasn't been. And the main function of education is to make children happy. It's interesting. I often hear from people, I just want my children to be happy. I did not hear that here, and I'm glad. Does that reflect a religious view? The main function is to make children happy, fulfilled, universal human beings. That is the false religion of humanism, right? The goal in life is to be happy. Whereas our founding fathers were Protestant, Reformed. The Westminster Confession says the chief aim of man is to glorify God and enjoy Him forever. So there's quite a conflict. That would be Noah Webster's, Dr. Benjamin Rush's worldview. They were pastors. John Adams' worldview would be the same. All of the founding fathers in there. There's this worldview clash between humanism and Christianity. Note this World Core curriculum. Ever hear that term? We hear a lot about Common Core. You've heard the World Core before, yeah. And the URLs down there, you can't really read them here, but it's from the United Nations Online website and the UNESCO website, which is United Nations again. This slide was up earlier. It's not unfair to say that Bill Gates' agenda is our agenda in education. Globalist, United Nations member. But this one really takes the cake, doesn't it? Education's all about social justice, and we heard from one of the parent speakers here, or was it the teacher? All the social justice included now in these problems, and not just in sort of social studies, but in math and other things.
Nathan, I remember when there was geography, and then they changed it to social studies. We were driving here, and we saw a van come by, had writing all over the side of it, and it said, seek social justice. And I thought to myself, not more than 2 hours ago, isn't justice just justice? What's social justice? I've read all the cases about justice, and I've never heard of social justice except from these people, whoever they are. They're promoting this idea. Let me give you a secret. There is no such thing. There's no such thing in our courts. The only kind of justice there is, and the only kind of justice there ever will be, is individual justice in individual cases. There is no group justice. There is no country justice. No, my rights are mine and I defend them individually, and you have to do the same thing. And you have a responsibility given to you to take care of your children. You're responsible for their education. It was given to you direct from the Creator. You cannot delegate it. It's impossible. It's your job. You made the choice when you decided to have children. And it's your job to teach them, and it's your job to defend your jurisdiction to do it. With every grant of jurisdiction, with every grant of right, with every grant of authority, those are synonyms, there comes the responsibility to defend your jurisdiction. We have a state legislator in the back. She is, what she's doing right now, listen to me close, she's defending her turf. What is her turf? Legislation. Is somebody trying to encroach? You bet. Some guy sitting in the White House and the governor's office, the executive branch, They're all trying to encroach upon the legislative branch all the time. And the legislative branch has a duty to not be a rubber stamp for others. Can I get an agreement on that? Okay. I just want to make sure I wasn't spinning out of control there. That's what this is all about. The world that we want here in America is disintegrated authority and jurisdiction. My father used to say, I thought he had said it himself, but he himself was quoting when he said this. I found out later. It was a Pennsylvania case. No man's life, liberty, or property is safe when the legislature is in session. So my father had a responsibility to try to stay ahead of him and defend his jurisdiction and his property. But your rights are your property, and your property are your rights. The same thing. You have rights in your property, your children. You have a property right, and the authority you have respecting your children, you can't get rid of it. And in the last day, you'll answer for it, no matter who you turn it over to. So just take it. Take the nettle. Go with it.
As if it couldn't get worse. It's not just about social justice, but teaching your children, or I should say their children, that's what they say, to be cooperative, planetary citizens. What does that even mean? Well, cooperative is quite a scary word. You will cooperate, or we will make you cooperate. Sounds like, again, common core is common will. It's their will. If you don't follow their will, they will ensure your cooperation. Number two, planetary. I've heard of global citizens and that hogwash. What is planetary citizenship? These people are spitting out that it's actually the word planet is a Greek word.
It's a Greek word, planeo. What means to wander.
Yeah.
It means to wander. Because the planets, people that first saw them, and if you've tried to examine planets, you'll notice too, they don't go like the stars. They appear to wander all over the sky. Until you really do the calculations, you discover that there's the heavenly bodies move according to very precise plan, the laws of nature. But they appeared to wander, so the ancients called them planeo. That's the verb for planets.
And a planetary gear set, in automotive terms, goes around. So don't think that they are not wisely choosing their words. Common core, planetary, cooperative planetary citizens. Remember the definition of rigor. Question your assumptions. Kids are just wandering out there. But it's great if they're wandering as long as they are cooperating with the powers that be. This again, United Nations Online. UNOL, the website, United Nations Online. This is the World Core Curriculum. Again, a revolution in education is needed. Revolution. Where have you heard that type of word before? That type of speaking? We're not ever talking about revolution. We're talking about rule of law. They're talking about revolution. Communists, right? Yeah. But supporters of their cause bringing about radical change. Again, radical, revolutionary. Communist terms. Change in the consciousness of the world. That sounds religious, doesn't it? Again, synthesis and cooperation. Do you want your children to learn to synthesize and cooperate? No. What does synthesis even mean? It's all nonsense. So that begs the question. We've sort of seen two views of education. That reflected by the Founding Fathers and those who answered the questions here in this room. Liberty, freedom to be free people versus cooperative planetary citizens, etc. So the parents in this room say we want our kids to learn this. And the United Nations Secretary of Education, there was one of the quotes from him, Bill Gates, etc., says we think education is about this. Well, who gets to decide? That question is, in other words, who has authority over education? You or they? Well, according to the U.S. Supreme Court, back in the 20s, this is 1923, government has no authority. Again, they're using that powerful word, authority. Government has no authority to interfere with the power of parents to control the education of their own. And again, these words were also wisely chosen. No authority to interfere with the power of parents to control the education of whom? Their own children. Again, God gave these children to you. He gave my children to me and your children to you. Nobody cares about my children more than my wife and I. Nobody cares about your children more than their two parents. And no government has authority to interfere with that. Why? This mere sounds almost like children are not only a creation of the state, but that's not historically the role of it. You looked this up, actually. We were saying, wait, what is this mere creature?
Nathan and I talk about when we say, what looks unusual here? Is there something we need to look into? That's an old case, and we read it a long time ago, but mere creature of the state. Operative words. In those days, mere creature of the state, I don't want to bust your eardrums out, am I hurting? You're being nice. I'm going to back off. I'm trying to project. Mere creature of the state means this. There, in those days, 1925, we're pushing 100 years ago now, but the courts distinguished between mere creatures of the state, corporations, creations. A creature is something that is directly created. Corporations, and mere creature of the state, a mere creature of God, is something quite different. Mere creature of the state, mere creature of God. Corporations are creations of the state. You and me, we're all creations of God. And that was the distinction that's being made here. A child is not a corporation. You know, corporations are under the control of the creator of the corporation. He who has the power to make has the power to dictate. Think about that. Did you take a part in making these children? I hope so. Somebody did. But whoever did that has the power of dictation according to true law, not according to paganism. It can get out of hand, and that happened in the ancient world. But you do have the power to dictate. You have the power to instruct your children. And I used to introduce myself in front of my children. Some of my children would be standing there, and they'd say, somebody introduce themselves to me, and I'd say, my name's Dick. This is my wife, Tater. Dictator. So my children would hear, see, they would understand who was in charge. It was a joke, but I'm not a dictator. But there was a time when our authority was a lot more powerful than my children than it is now. Now it's a matter of influence that comes less directly. I had to learn that. Took a while.
So yes, this is stating that because children were not created by the state, like a corporation, limited liability company, etc., created pursuant to state statute, but rather created by the parents through God, the parents have the right, and check out these words, the right coupled with the high duty to recognize and prepare the child for future obligation. And we often talk about rights, and especially the United Nations, they have their Declaration of Universal Human Rights, such as the right to a job, the right to a comfortable living, et cetera, et cetera. The right to food, the right to health care, which is sort of a false right. Like somebody has to pay for that housing, the food, the health care, et cetera. Whereas the Declaration of 76 talks about inherent rights given to us by our Creator. Right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. It's like obvious to everybody that our Creator gave us these rights. They're actually duties. For instance, the Second Amendment right to bear arms is a duty to preserve life. First Amendment religious freedom is a duty to worship the Lord your God and serve Him only. It comes from the Bible, which the Declaration of 76 says, the law of nature is God. You want to briefly touch on that because it's an important distinction here between a right, like somebody owes me something, versus a duty. We owe to our children the duty. We have to preserve their life. If you don't feed your children, the state will come in and put you in jail and feed your kids for you, right? You can't neglect your children. You don't have the right to do that. You have the duty to provide for your children.
We used to have hackamores. Does that ring a bell with anybody? Hackamore is that thing you put on a horse. And, oh, that's a funny word. And I got older, I looked it up. And then I found out that there were hackneyed words related. Something that's hackneyed is limited and it's That's what a hackamore does. It slows the horse down. But the word right is hackneyed. Over the centuries, it has become hackneyed until it means the opposite of what was intended. The word right to us today, we think of selfishness. What I want, what I get. You're not going to take my stuff. That's not the way it's supposed to be really viewed. It's supposed to be understood. It's an old Anglo word, and it means duty. It became popular. It's a Germanic word. When I say it's Anglo, it became popular during World War II. Not because people liked it, but because Hitler said that he was the master of the Third Reich. Well, that's an old German word for a certain aspect of law. And it's about duty. It's not about what is mine and I'm going to get it and be selfish. We made a selfish word out of it. It's not. It's about duties. In law is often said that every right is accompanied by a duty. That's not true at all. Every right is a duty in old speech. And in the older world, 200-300 years ago, that's the way the word was understood. And we've made something quite different out of it, haven't we? And it's twisted our whole view of our liberty. Our liberty is a duty. And we only receive fulfillment as we fulfill those duties. But you got to know your duty. We are not like the soldier who's not under orders. We have duties, and they're good ones, and they're fulfilling ones. Again, because we don't know our duties as a people, we are lawless, and we see the results of it around us as they swirl. You let your children out of your house, they're in gross darkness out there. I walk around and see it. But the remedy to that is law, true law. You must learn it, you must know it, and understand what your duties are, which are your rights, your authority, your jurisdiction. Those are all synonyms.
This first Supreme Court case arose when some parents in Nebraska, Meyer, good German name, right? You mentioned the Germanic roots of the word duty. They wanted to teach their kids German. Well, it was 1923, so this arose in the 19-teens. The case eventually made it to the U.S. Supreme Court. World War I's going on. The state of Nebraska said, you're not teaching your kids German, we're fighting those people. Come on. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court said, no, the parents get to decide. If they want to teach their kids German, it's their right. Because they have the authority. And this Pierce v. Society of Sisters, 2 years later, the Supreme Court decided, the state of Oregon passed a compulsory education law. You will send your children to the public school, period. Society of Sisters ran a Catholic school. Obviously, they weren't happy about it because nobody's enrolling in their school anymore because the state now says, no, you got to send them to the public school. The Supreme Court said, no, I don't think so. One thing to provide schools, and we'll be getting to that. It's another thing to say everybody's going to this school, period. It's up to the parents. And Thomas Jefferson, anybody ever heard of him? You didn't have Common Core history then. But what does he say about kind of going back to, whether German's taught? What if your kids learn German? Who gets to decide that? Federal government? State government, Department of Education, school board? Parents. Again, we'll be getting to the duty of the legislature to establish and maintain a system of public schools that's open to all the public. But these decisions, Thomas Jefferson, who was a big fan of education, of universal education, he wrote extensively. This letter, he was saying, we got to educate the people of America. And you know what? I'm in the federal government, and I can't do it because the federal government doesn't have authority. And anyway, those who decide exactly what's taught, how it's taught, that needs to be the parents, because nobody cares more about the kids than their parents. So the answer, who has authority over education? Parents. And remember, that authority is a duty to protect that. Not to just say, oh, they told me I have to do this, well, I guess. But rather, Supreme Court says you have the authority, you have the duty to educate your children. Don't let other people roll over you. That begs the question then, what about the feds? Do they have any authority over this? Who thinks there is federal authority over education? Legitimate authority. Not that they can, but that they have the legal authority. I'm not seeing any hands. I'm saying shaking heads, no. Again, Jefferson, that letter again, he He's talking about education, really important. And he obviously knows what's in the Constitution. He wasn't directly involved in the writing because he was out of the country in France, but he was writing letters back and forth with those who did write the Constitution. And he said, yeah, I'd love to educate the Americans, but I'm in the federal government, it's not in the Constitution. 10th Amendment says if we didn't explicitly put it in here, we don't have the authority. Because remember, how did the Constitution come about? What are the first words in there? We, the people of the United States, have all of the authority given because we're free, and so we're going to give certain authority to the federal government to do things. Education wasn't among them. So the Common Core blatantly violates the 10th Amendment. Representative Reinbold had a slide with this white paper. It was written by the former General Counsel and Deputy General Counsel of the U.S. Department of Education. In that white paper, they go over this. They say, Common Core is completely bogus. It violates 3 federal statutes. It violates the 10th Amendment. Governor Jindal of Louisiana used that as a template for his lawsuit that's still pending. I had my office check Pacer because there have been rumors floating around, oh, Jindal's lawsuit was dismissed. That's bogus. I went on Pacer, that's where you find out about federal court cases. I'm a lawyer, so I tend to go on to Pacer, and it's still pending. And again, these statutes, Congress agrees. Now, this is kind of odd, because in effect, it'd be like me issuing a decree that, by the way, I can't tell your kids what to eat for lunch. You'd be like, why are you even talking about that? You know, it's obvious, right? I can tell my kids what to eat for lunch, but not yours. They say in their 3 federal statutes on education, yeah, we don't have authority over education. Kind of like a bit odd, but we don't even need to go there because these statutes there, which are 2 of them from '65, General Education Protection Act and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. Remember Representative Reinbold mentioned that one. That's the one where we get the SIA waiver, SIA being the statute. That's how the federal government sends taxpayer money down to the states with strings attached saying, you do this and we'll give you money. Now it started off, it was written in '65. What was going on in the '60s? Civil rights movement, right? So this school was for white people, this school was for others, et cetera, and the federal government said, no, that's a bunch of nonsense. So what do we do about it? Well, we can't, we don't have, nobody ever went to the federal school, right? Anybody here graduate from a federal school? There aren't any. So they said, well, how do we do this? Okay, we're going to give the states money, but only if they comply with the desegregation. Sounds like a noble cause, right? So we'll assume that they had noble things in mind. Now they're using it to implement Common Core, saying if you want our money, you're going to do what we say. In that statute, in all 3 of these, then the 1979 was Department of Education Organizing Act. That's when we got the U.S. Department of Education under Carter. All of those, and this is in the handout, have provisions that say, number 1, parents have the authority. Number 2, the states have a role. Number 3, and it's not in this slide because it didn't fit, but long wording about we don't have any authority. We, the federal government, have no authority over the assessments, the curriculum, the textbooks, the testing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All the nitty-gritty that Common Core is. They say in each of these 3 statutes, pretty much the same wording copied, we don't have authority over that. We might have authority to make sure that they're not segregated schools and this and that, but as far as the stuff Common Core is about, they admit it themselves. And that's what these 3, or the 2 Department of Education lawyers who were under Bush II went out when Obama came in. They said, what's going on here? We used to be the lawyers here at the DOE, and now under the Obama administration, this nonsense is going on. We can't do that. They can't do that. It's all lawless. What Duncan is doing is lawless. So let's take a little step back. And I don't know how clear it is on this screen, but what's government spending doing? Out of control? Okay. Taxes going up? Yep. You ever hear about them going down? No, not really. Property tax, sales tax. Out in Wasilla, they raised it 50% increase what a year or 2 ago, from 2% to 3%. Other places it's over 10%. How's the budget doing? Balanced budget? Out of control, right? Inflation. How much did you pay for a gallon of gas, a loaf of bread, a gallon of milk, a house, a car? Boy. Government control of wages. Anybody hear about the $15 an hour in Seattle and what San Francisco, a place like that? Okay. Socialistic controls. Anybody self-employed? Looking at like, I mean, shoot, even Alaska wants like business license for rolling business. Nonsense. Okay. So these things aren't made up. It's this list, right? It's all happening. Far more centralized or centralization of power in Washington, D.C. Well, what's this whole talk about? Ed, right? How about Arctic National Wildlife Refuge? What's going on up there? We had a standoff. The Bundy Ranch, what was that, a year and a half ago? The Fed's moving in to take some farmer's ranch. Federal aid to and control over education. And that's what they're doing. It's, like I said, through the ASEA flexibility waivers, through this federal statute, they're saying, if you want our money, you're going to do what we say. Number 9's interesting, hammering into us, but it'll bring global peace. Remember the quote from the United Nations earlier? Oh, if we educate our children to be cogs in the wheel of planetary whatever, there will be peace.
Nathan, I had said this in our previous, but it just came to mind. I forget the fellow's name, H.G. Wells. He wrote that 10-volume set on the history of the world. And then in the, is that it, H.G. Wells? And in the last volume, volume 10, is a summary of the others. But in his summary, he says that in his opinion, after all these years of writing these 10 volumes, studying the history of the world 4,000 years ago forward, he finds 165 years approximately of peace. 165 years. And during that 165 years, men were reloading their weapons. That's what he said. And that is true. And peace, hear me, friends, neighbors, and relatives, peace is not the absence of fighting and conflict and war. Never has been, never will be. The word peace, even in our own common law understanding, and in the ancient understanding, you can go to the Far East and find this. You'll meet a fellow over there in the Arab countries, he'll say, Salam Lakum, peace to you. You go over to Israel, they'll say, Shalom Lakim, peace to you. And they're both of them be decked out with weapons bristling. Why? Because they understand what we in the West have forgotten. That peace is not the absence of war, it is the presence of order in the midst of battle. That's what peace is. Because the enemy wants to bring disorder to your family. And if the enemy can do that, you're destroyed. One other illustration. I remember the San Diego Chargers, the football team. They never won a game. And the owners hired a bunch of shrinks to come in, try to evaluate why they'd never won a game. And they didn't find the answer, but they came up with some fascinating observations. And they noticed a difference between the offensive team's lockers and the defensive team's lockers. When they get done with practice and go home, then they went and opened all their lockers, and the defensive team lockers, they just take their stuff off, and it was all piled in there. The offensive team locker, everything was in perfect order. Because the defensive team spent all their time figuring out how they could bring disorder to the enemy, and they didn't want to do anything to tear things apart and destroy it. And it pervaded every area of their life. That was a fascinating point. And that's what the enemy wants to do to you. And if you maintain order, true lawfulness, and do things the way, do your duty, you will win. But the key to winning is not going out and fighting necessarily, and swinging your fist and shooting a gun. That's not it. The key to winning is to keep order in your family. And the way to do that is to teach your children what is right, do your duty, and do not let the enemy encroach, because they will destroy the order. They will teach your little boys that they're little girls, and they will teach your little girls that they're little boys. That's fundamental destruction of order, friends. I'm not a little girl, never was. That's confusion. And that's a fundamental confusion. That's why I mentioned it. It's a fundamental confusion we're facing. The enemy knows that, and they are out to destroy it. Maintain order, the true order, and you'll win.
we pretty much agree all of this came true, right? It's written 20 years before I was born, 1959, by the founder of the John Birch Society. I just bring it up because back then he sounded like a wacko, didn't he? Think about number 7 and 8. He wrote this again. Well, it was given in a speech in December of '58, written down in '59, before the first Federal Education Act. Remember, they were from 1965, and he's talking about the federal control over education. So back then he sounded like a lunatic, and now we're all like, yeah, this is what we're living. So, free ebook to the one who answers this correctly. Separation of two spheres is one of the Constitution's structural protections of liberty. What are the two spheres? Five, four, three.
Myself and the government.
Very close. Very close. I'm willing to give you a free ebook for that. Federal and state. So it's your duty now to give me your email address. Supreme Court's made clear, again, and this is Sheriff Mack, in case you don't recognize him with me, before the Republican National Convention in 12 at the Fall Festival. In his case, remember, the federal government tried to commandeer the sheriffs to do the background checks before you could buy a gun, because the Second Amendment says that's okay, right? In any event, that case has a holding that was consistent back to cases from the 20s and beyond that are in my handout, that the federal government has no authority to use federal money to coerce the state to act where the federal government doesn't have the authority to act. We've determined, right, there aren't any federal schools. Why? Because there's no authority for them. Thus, they may not, according to the Supreme Court, use money to say, well, states do what we want, or you don't get the money. Okay, but what if the state wants to do it anyway? Because it sounds like a good idea. Wait a minute, the Supreme Court also said, yeah, the state doesn't have the authority to do that. Why is that? Again, this is the 10th Amendment. The Supreme Court says the 10th Amendment protects us, we the people. So if it's my right, nobody else has the authority to interfere with that, right? I can't give away your car or your house. If you want to do it, maybe you can give away your house or your car or whatever, but it's not mine, therefore I don't have the authority to do it. Same thing. The state doesn't have the authority to agree with the federal government. Yeah, we want the money, we'll do what you say, because that law protects us. And it's pretty obvious why I have yet to meet parents who are willing to give that up. So what if they do enact laws? What if your local school board says, well, the state said it's the law of the land, Fed say it's the law of the land, so we say it's the law of the land. I'm the teacher, so I just have to comply with these orders. No, the Supreme Court says, no, that's invalid. The Supreme Court says you, the teacher, you, the principal, you, the school board member, have the duty to resist this and say, no, that's not the law. You're telling me to do something that's illegal. And ultimately, you, the parent, remember that the duty of the parent is the ultimate duty over the child. But remind your school board members, your teachers, your principals, etc., State Board of Education, remind them they have the duty to stand in the gap. In other words, this kind of sums it up. Because the federal government has no authority over education, the federal government has no authority to tell the states what to do respecting education. That's pretty simple, right? If I can't, for instance, sell your house because it's not my house, I can't tell Brent to go sell your house. Clear, simple, easy, right? The feds don't have authority over education, therefore they can't tell the states what to do over education. Which begs the question, what about the state? Do they even have any authority over education? I don't want to offend Representative Reinbold, but and there's no risk of that because yes, they do. In fact, Representative Reinbold and her colleagues have the duty to establish and maintain a system of public schools open to all the public. Why? Where did she get that duty? See, sorry, it's not the right of the state; it's their obligation. Well, we gave it to them. We, the people of the state of Alaska, wrote the Alaska Constitution. And we can get into John Locke as to, I wasn't around back then, so why does it apply to me? But it doesn't, because I'm here. And in there we said the state of Alaska, the legislature has to establish and maintain a system of public schools open to all the public. Does that mean that you as a parent must send your child there, or the state of Alaska can force you to send your child there? No, remember that Supreme Court case where they tried to do that in Oregon? And the Supreme Court said, no. It's up to the parents if they want to send their kids or not send their kids. And I'll note also the preamble. Why did we write the Alaska Constitution? We, the people of Alaska, grateful to God. So if they want to somehow say that you can't say the word God, well, it's in the Constitution, so, and it's in the Declaration of Independence.
For whatever reason, the state's adopting a common core, then that is all pointless to this.
The state doesn't have the authority to do that.
The state has the power to do that, they're just adopting.
The ability to do it, like I have the ability to drive 100 miles an hour, but not the authority to do it. It's lawless.
But isn't that in our Constitution?
No, they have the duty to establish and maintain a system of public schools,
They can't
but
tell
there's
what's
a
that,
case
what's it.
coming up where they don't have the authority to standardize our children.
See, I have a daughter that's becoming a teacher, I'm trying to, she's a senior, I'm trying to talk her out of even going into the program. You know,
Right.
She's smart, go do something else. 'cause
There's a lot of indoctrination in the program.
She loves teaching kids, but she's already running into it in the UA.
Correct. Yeah, they're bringing that in, and it's lawlessness. And a teacher has a duty to stand up and say, no, this is the law.
She has to get an attorney then and just sue like the dean and sue the state and start just suing everybody? Is that
It might have to come with that. We have a clerk in Kentucky who went to jail or federal prison over the weekend without a trial, by the way, remember, without a jury trial, for standing up and saying, no, the Kentucky Constitution says this. The Kentucky state law says this. The U.S. Constitution, wait, I don't go to the federal government to get a marriage license. Why? Because they don't have authority over that. The state does.
right? And they pick and choose.
And this is
The
what-
Muslim doesn't have to do it, but the Christian has to.
Right. So, unfortunately, sometimes things come to a clash. You can choose to avoid the system, or if you participate in the system, be prepared to stand up for what's right. And we're running out of time here, so I'll try to be quick. What protections does the Constitution afford? This one, obviously, I'm watching you. Fourth Amendment, privacy. We talked about the data privacy with the AMP testing. Well, U.S. Department of Education wants to track your children not only through school, but also into the workforce to determine how much do they make, so how good was the education. So make sure before you leave, you report your earnings to the school you attended when you were a child. Wait a minute. Well, how do they get that information then? Commissioner of Internal Revenue in his strategic plan says, yeah, we're cooperating with state, local, federal, and not only in the United States, but even international countries to share how much money you're making. So that's how, otherwise, how does the Department of Education know how much you're making when you get out of school? This is from, I get emails from the IRS because I defend people against their tyranny. I'm a tax practitioner, so under FATCA, Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act, they even announced, yeah, we're doing these international databases, sharing your information. Why would they do that? Well, it's international treaties with the United Nations, because they say nobody should be invisible. We want a world that counts. Everybody needs to be registered by 2030, and they're meeting right now, right, with the 2030 agenda. What date is up here? 2030. This thing's a couple years old from the United Nations website. They've been planning this 2030 because they got behind schedule on the Agenda 21. What else? Is it not bad enough? Ever hear of the Compacts Clause? The states aren't allowed to make agreements without U.S. congressional approval. Unfortunately, the Department of Education, federal executive branch, not legislature, said you got to do SBAC, Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium, PARC. Alaska was doing SBAC, got out of that. Now it's spending $5 million a year to the University of Kansas to do the same thing that's aligned with SBAC. Well, a judge in Missouri said SBAC is unconstitutional. Violates Compacts Clause, pretty clear. Because U.S. Congress, remember, there's no federal statute that says anything about this. The federal statutes say this is all illegal. I mean, it's clear. But, so Judge, this was of course appealed by the losing party, ones who want to be in SBAC, and that's pending now.
Just a little bit off topic, but not necessarily. I know with regards to the concealed carry firearm, some states have reciprocity with other states. Would that be a violation of the compact?
That's a good question. That's a
I'm
good
kind of
question.
hoping it's not.
The courts haven't said it is.
The courts haven't said it is. Nobody's challenged that.
Yeah.
But that's an interesting question. The only thing I would say is that the Second Amendment is a fundamental right our Creator grants us. And so such a law only recognizes that fact and isn't.
Well, ideally, reciprocity as far as firearms, in my mind, should
So
extend to all of it.
you go into, we can discuss a related question after, because I got to get through this, but you raise a very valid point, has to do with the 14th Amendment and the Heller case and the McDonald case on the Second Amendment, 2008 and 10, or 10 and 12, the two big Supreme Court cases on the Second Amendment, and that we could discuss after. But that's a great point. This is the Orthodox Church in Anilchik. Obviously, we're talking about religious freedom. First Amendment, by the way, remember, if you read it, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. In other words, Congress has no jurisdiction over religion, because remember, God made us and we made the government, so the government can't say this God or that God or whatever, right? It's been twisted around, but in any event, when we were in Sitka, this was a big deal, so if you like watching fun movies that are not rated R, you can watch my YouTube video of, well, the three of us talking in Sitka and the superintendent there getting all up in arms when I put the slide up and asked, now Mary, are you here in the audience? And she freaked out. You decide. I think I didn't, all I did was put up, this is from the Alaska Public Media website, so it's, you know, it's on the internet. Obama hailed her for implementing this Connect Ed, adding internet connectivity to the schools in Sitka, which if you look at this, it sure appears to me, this is should be in your, well, if it's not in your slides, it's on the YouTube video, but it's all about social justice. They're connecting schools with schools in Qatar, however you pronounce it, Sharia law country. You look up CIA World Factbook, just Google it, they're operating under Sharia law over there in the Middle East. Delayed indefinitely parliamentary elections. You know, women don't have rights over there. It's the whole bad news. That's why we want to connect our U.S. schools with them. It might have something to do with that the Qatar Foundation International is a minority shareholder, like 10%, I think, in Pearson. So instead of connecting all schools, why don't we just connect the dots and see what's going on here? And why would the superintendent be all upset that I'm simply putting a newspaper or online newspaper article up on the screen, saying, are you in? And I said, hey, do you want to talk about it? Do you want to explain? Didn't want to.
It was an attempt to bring disorder to order.
Yeah, it was a time to
That's
bring
what it
disorder
was.
to the presentation. It's all on video, caught on video, so you decide. But yeah, and Sitka, Mount Edgecombe in Sitka is the only state-run school, I understand, from Representative Brian Bull. So that's sort of like where things originate, which seems to me, you know, why would Obama get superintendent from Sitka to Washington, D.C.? But yeah, advancing global citizenship through education is just outrageous. So what can we do? Number one, protect your children. Remember, they are your children, not anybody else's. The buck stops with you. In the end, you're going to be held accountable. Whatever happens, you can't say, well, the governor told me I had to, well, the school board member, well, the superintendent, well, they had a bad teacher. In the end, it's up to you. I know what I would do. What I'm doing is not let my kids within a mile of a public school. But on the flip side, the legislature has a duty to provide these schools, and thus providing them, they have no authority to say, well, if you send your kid here, your kid doesn't have Fourth Amendment rights, your kid doesn't. They try to do this, but that's lawless. So if you feel compelled to send your kids there, stand up and say, no, just because you're providing this doesn't mean that we don't have any rights. If you send your kid to a public school, they can't starve your kid, right? Well, you send them, you sign them up. That's kind of what they're trying to do. Well, they have to take this test, they have to do this. So stand up, but you know, that's number one. Number two, you know, inform your neighbors, empower yourself. Knowing this stuff, knowing that it's unlawful, is power. Because now you know what to do, what your rights are, what your duties are, where their authority ends. And then number three is equipping your officials. So the book I'm giving out is the Doctrine of Lesser Magistrates. I recommend everybody read that. The Doctrine of Lesser Magistrates stands for the proposition that somebody in authority, whether it be a parent, whether it be a school teacher, whether it be a sheriff, whether it be a legislator, has the duty to disobey an unlawful order. Easy example, World War II. Well, my commanding officer told me I had to murder the Jewish person. Well, what did we do with that? We had the war crimes trial. We said, no, that's not an excuse. That was murder. I don't care who told you to do it. I don't care if Obama tells you to do it. If Obama says to murder that person, murder's murder. You have a duty to intervene, and not only to disobey that, but then to protect that person. And is there anybody more worthy of protection than our children? So you, the parents, ultimately have the duty to protect your children. If you entrust them to a teacher, that teacher better be protecting that child. Because if the teacher doesn't protect the child, the teacher will also be answering in the end. Etc. The principal has a duty to protect the children. That's the Doctrine of Lesser Magistrates. Recommend the book. I'll be giving, you wanted to give me your email address. And so what can we as parents then do is, like Brent said, respecting Representative Reingold, help them, assist them, empower them to do this. You yourselves do it and empower the others, your neighbors, your friends. Spread the knowledge. And thank you for coming. We're right on time. So let's see. Yeah, we're going to have to move the table. So if you do have questions, just please let me get the room back for them, and then I'll hang around a little bit.